Did you know that for many decades, Hollywood wasn't just avoiding telling LGBTQ+ stories, they were actively censoring them? This is due to something called the Hays Code, and whilst the Hays Code did specifically apply to Hollywood films, its reach extended way beyond that, specifically into queer literature. Writers in this time, so the mid 20th century, knew that if they wanted their books to be adapted into movies, which was, and I suppose still is, a huge source of prestige, they also had to abide by the same rules as the Hollywood filmmakers. The Hays Code was a set of moral guidelines put in place from 1938 to 1968 that heavily restricted depictions of sex, crime, and deviance, under which fell queerness. So today, in this video essay, I suppose, we're going to explore how the Hays Code has shaped portrayal of queer people in literature, in media in general, but mostly literature. Hi, I'm Georgia. I talk about gay books on the internet. It's kind of my entire thing. All these books behind me, gay. All of them. Well, most of them. A lot of them, gay. If that's something that might interest you, and if you've clicked on this video in the first place, and I'm sure it probably is, then make sure you subscribe because I've got lots of similar videos coming this way. So many gay books to talk about, so little time. And if you've been around here for a while, if you come here from my other channel, my True Crime History channel, you're probably thinking, Georgia, you've already spoken about the Hays Code. What are you doing? And that is true. I do have another video on the Hays Code on my other channel, but that was more of like a general overview into the queerness of it all. This is specifically diving into the queer literature and how all of that was affected. It's different, okay? But if you do want to see the other video, which goes a lot more in depth into the code as a whole, I'll link it somewhere up here or down below. So I suppose our first question we should answer is, what is the Hays Code? We need a bit of history, we need a bit of context here. The Hays Code is the informal name for the Motion Picture Production Code, which was basically a set of rules that American media, but specifically American films, had to follow to adhere to the American Christian values. And that is a sentence you're going to be hearing a lot in this video, American Christian values. That is all what this was based on. Basically, any films coming out of Hollywood had to be moral and wholesome and encourage correct thinking amongst the American general public. And by correct thinking, of course, they meant Christian thinking. This entire thing was very much backed up by Christians, by American evangelicals, by the Catholic Church. There was to be no sinful behaviour, at least no sinful behaviour that wasn't obviously very sinful behaviour. And that included, of course, homosexuality. In the early days of the Hays Code, there was just no gays at all, no queer representation on screen in the slightest. And then towards the end of the Hays Code, they did start to realise that they could include gay characters on screen, but they just had to be the villains. It is no coincidence that still, even today, a lot of villains on TV and film are very explicitly queer-coded. I mean, off the top of my head, we have Scar from The Lion King, we have Hades from Hercules, we have every James Bond villain ever. All very, very queer-coded. It's meant to tell you, the audience, that gay equals villain, gay equals bad. And for those of you who don't know what queer coding is subtextual coding of a character in the media as queer. So it's not explicitly said or confirmed within the piece of work, but instead they're coded as queer through use of traits and stereotypes recognisable to the audience. It's a way to include queer characters or even just capture the attention of the LGBTQ+ community without the straight viewers necessarily realising what's going on. And this is used in many different ways in the media, not just through villains. I mean, writers know there is nothing more feral than a teenage lesbian on the internet who smells just the tiniest bit of gay in her favourite character in a TV show. But writers also know that if they were to make that character come out as a lesbian, they're immediately going to be losing the interest of the straight people. So what they do is they code it. They make it very subtle but obvious to the queer community who know what they're looking for. But we'll talk more about that later in the episode. First, let's talk about how all of this came about in the first place. Like, why did they need the Hays Code? It started in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. The world had just come out of the Great War, World War One, and the Spanish influenza. Industry was now booming. People were looking to party, to celebrate. They'd just been through a really, really hard couple of decades, and now they were free. They could do what they want. So this was a time of real excess, especially in America. And this was very much reflected in the type of movies that were coming out of Hollywood. Silent films were beginning to filter out around this time, and talkies were coming in, meaning a lot more could be depicted on film film than it ever could have been before. And this led to completely immoral things being shown in American films, like, gasp, women having agency over their own bodies and being shown in positions of power, drugs and alcohol being alluded to. Not explicitly shown, but alluded to. That was enough to be scandalous in this time. There was partying, there was overindulgence, and soon the American public, the American Christian public, started sending in complaints. Also, generally in this time, there were also just like a lot of Hollywood scandals. There were drug overdoses left, right, and centre. Hollywood stars were dying, they're being murdered, there were sexual assaults, there were rapes. Like, it was a really bad time for Hollywood, like, undeniably bad things were happening in Hollywood at this time. And it became this whole media frenzy. The public were obsessed with finding out about the latest scandals coming out of Hollywood. And that is what kept moviegoers going back to the cinema, going back to the theatre, I suppose Americans would say. Because people love a scandal. I mean, it's still, I suppose, the same today. Think about all the Don't Worry Darling scandals. Like, I know I was about to say that's the reason I went to see it. I didn't. I went to see Don't Worry Darling because Harry Styles. But like, the scandals, it got people into seats in the cinema. People were intrigued by this movie, and it was exactly the same back in the 1920s, 1930s. But on the other hand, you had religious society, American evangelicals clutching at their pearls, sure that these questionable morals were going to destroy society as they knew it. And a lot of pressure was put on the government to do something about this. I'm just going to read directly from my notes now because I do not want to get these numbers wrong. In 1921 alone, legislators in 27 states introduced almost 100 film censorship bills, meaning that basically different things were being allowed in different states. This movie could be shown in this state but not in this state, and they had to remove this scene for this state but it could be in for that state. It just got very, very confusing. How are you supposed to work around all these different rules? And people started to become really, really concerned that the government was just going to ban movies entirely. So the film studios decided to take things into their own hands, hiring a man called William Hayes, who was put in charge of self-regulating the studios. He was a Presbyterian elder, he was very high up in the church, and he was the former head of the Republican National Committee. He had some very, very strong religious opinions over what was moral and what wasn't, and he was going to tell you about it. In 1924, Hayes introduced a set of recommendations that he advised the movie studios to follow, and this wasn't law, these were just recommendations, but all in all, it didn't really make much of a difference. Film studios just kind of hoped that having somebody in place, like, showed that they were trying to do something without actually having to do the things that he was recommending. They hoped that would be enough for the government to be like, okay, yeah, it's fine, movies are fine. But of course, it wasn't really. There was still outrage around every corner. And then the 1930s rolled around, the Great Depression happened, and somehow Hollywood got even more scandalous. I mean, if you think about it, people had no money whatsoever during this time, but also people were craving escapism, they were craving getting out of their own lives for a little bit. And movie studios knew that if they needed to entice people, to pull people in, movies had to be even more risque, even more violent. Gangster movies became a really, really big thing during this time because they were just pulling out all of the stops to get people to part with their money that they didn't have. And it's here in the early to mid 1930s that the Hays Code in all its glory was formed. So there were 3 general principles of the Hays Code. 1, no picture should lower the moral standards of anyone who sees it. So basically there was no sympathising or lying on the side of the villain. 2, the correct standards of life should be presented, which is the Christian standards of life. And 3, law, natural or human, should not be ridiculed. And there was also no sympathy for violation of the law. So that was kind of the main framework, but obviously there were a lot of subcategories laid underneath all of that. There was to be no vulgarity at all, no obscenity. The words Jesus, Christ, God, Lord, etc. were never to be taken in vain, and interestingly, never mentioned outside a church or religious setting. There was no ridicule of faith, any minister of religion was to always be a good person. There was to be no nudity or semi-nudity under any circumstance, and obviously in the 1930s their definition of nudity was very different from our version of nudity nowadays. Things were very, very modest. There was to be no obscene dancing, nothing that even nods to any sort of sexuality. You get the gist. I mean, even bedrooms couldn't be featured a lot of the time in these movies because bedrooms makes people think of sex, and people can't think of sex because that is disgusting. And this is where I suppose we come to the relevant portion of the video, the sexuality portion of the video. The Hays Code states that the sanctity of the institution and home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low form of sex relationships are the accepted or common thing. It also reads, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. And it's that one line, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden, that still affects queer representation in movies and TV to this very day. And of course, if things are affecting movies and TV, it's also to an extent still affecting queer literature. And they didn't need to expand in the code on what sexual perversion was because everyone knew what that referred to, homosexuality. So basically you had no sex perversion, relationships had to be of a traditional moral standard, and films had to promote a correct standard of life. Basically, a big no-no for the gays. Interestingly, the Hays Code was never actually law. This was entirely voluntary, but it kind of got to a point where if your movie wasn't following the Hays Code, it wasn't going to be seen, it wasn't going to be distributed in theatres, so yeah, it kind of was a rule, you had to do it. And that was especially true after the Catholic Church got involved. In the 1930s, the Catholic Church had a lot of power in the USA, I mean, I suppose it still does. There were 20 million Catholic people living in the US at this time, and if I remember correctly, I did Google it yesterday, the population of America was only 122 million in the 30s, so 20 million people, 122 million people total, that's like, I was about to say that's 20%, that's not 20%, it's less than 20%, but I can't do that kind of maths. I don't know, but that's a big percentage. So if the Catholic Church is sending out notices being like, don't go see this movie, its followers aren't going to go see it. And even within the Hays Code, the church came up with its own rating system for films as well. It was a system of A to C, A being a movie was morally unobjectionable, like it was fine, there was nothing of concern in it, and C was condemned. Even if a movie like passed the Hays Code and got released, if the Catholic Church and turned around and was like, oh, it does this one thing, it's condemned, that was it, 20 million people, gone. So yeah, filmmakers had no choice but to follow the Hays Code to the letter. And so, almost overnight, LGBTQ plus characters were scrubbed from screen. They were gone. They went from Marlene Dietrich wearing suits, which was no longer allowed, by the way, because women had to dress in a womanly manner, and Marlene Dietrich flirting with women on screen, to nothing. No queer representation whatsoever. And even before this point, queer representation in movies wasn't great, but like, it was better. For a while, queer characters were erased completely, but then they realised they can do better than that. They can make queer people the villains, or they can punish them for their sins. They can make sure that the American general public knows that being gay is bad, and you will suffer. And this is where we begin to get into the book angle of it all. Okay, context is important. I needed to tell you all of that to make the rest of this make sense. Whilst the Hays Code did only specifically apply to Hollywood films, it had a much broader impact, including into literature. The code reinforced broader societal taboos about the LGBTQ+ community, affecting how books were published, marketed, and received. There was this kind of indirect censorship, like writers knew if they wanted their books to be made into movies, they also had to adhere by the same moral restrictions. And so, as a result, many authors deliberately toned down or subtly queer-coded characters in their books instead to make them more palatable to the wider audience. Publishers were scared to release queer stories, even though there wasn't anything necessarily stopping them. They were scared to release them because they feared public backlash, or they feared sales being severely limited. What's the point in writing a book and trying to get it released if it's not going to sell, if the Catholic Church are going to turn around and be like, bad? And you will be shocked at some of the very obviously, very clearly queer books in this time that actually were adapted onto screen, but they were completely changed. Every element of queerness was just removed. And I don't know if they did this to try and rewrite the storylines of these books, so when people thought about these books, they were no longer thinking about the gay aspect, they were thinking about what they saw in this film, maybe. And one prime example of this is The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1890 by Oscar Wilde. Like, yes, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the very, very gay Picture of Dorian Gray by the very, very gay Oscar Wilde, was adapted into film in 1945, and all elements of gayness, of queerness, were removed from the film. I'm going to read a bit from my notes for this next section because I want to get my facts right. Dorian Gray, it is full of homoerotic themes. The entire basis of this book is Basil's very gay fixation, infatuation with Dorian. But no, in the movie, that is just reframed as artistic admiration, let's say. That's it. They destroyed it. There's The Fox by D.H. Lawrence, which was published in 1923. This book had a very obvious, very clear lesbian relationship between two women. Of course, a lesbian relationship between two women. And their relationship is kind of disrupted when a man comes into their life. In the 1967 film adaptation, so this was like towards the end of the Hays Code as well, this was changed into a very typical heterosexual love triangle. It was just a love triangle. Gayness, gone. Tea and Sympathy by Robert Anderson was published in 1953, in which a young boy is bullied for being perceived as gay, whilst his teacher's wife tries to help him navigate his identity. And although in the book it's still never explicitly said that he is queer, it is strongly suggested that he is. Like, in this time, you couldn't be like, this character is gay. You could queer code it, you could imply it. In the film, though, the ending is completely changed when the boy realises that he is indeed straight after all. He is definitely straight. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, the book was released in 1938. I did read Rebecca when I was a teenager. I vividly remember reading it and I really enjoyed it. And I can't find my copy anywhere. I've looked and I just don't know where it is. I think I've probably got rid of it in one of my house moves over the years, but I have read it. But I did also have to rely a lot on Google to help me with this because it was a long time ago and I don't have the book anymore. Rebecca as a book contains very strong homoerotic subtext between Rebecca and Mrs. Danvers. Obviously, it's up to you as the reader how you interpret the relationship between them, whether you see it as obsession or just intense love. That's part of the joy of reading. But I think it is pretty undeniable. There's something a little bit gay going on in Rebecca. Something quite gay going on in Rebecca. In the movie, in Hitchcock's 1940 movie, yes, 1940, a lot of this subtext was removed and Mrs. Danvers was turned into your stereotypical portrayal of the creepy, predatory lesbian. And that is something we see over and over again. Of course, it's not explicitly said that she is a creepy, predatory lesbian because it's 1940, they wouldn't be able to say that, but it is very much implied. Queer coding. In the book, she's got this unwavering, obsessive devotion to Rebecca. In the movie, she's made out to be pure evil through the use of lighting and cinematography. She is an evil, older, creepy woman. Yeah, it is the classic queer villain trope. Her severe appearance, lack of interest in men, and obsessive devotion to Rebecca mark her as an outsider, reinforcing a negative stereotype of queer women as bitter and predatory. In the novel, Mrs. Danvers disappears in the fire at the end. Her fate is ambiguous. We don't really know what happened. It symbolises the loss of her entire world, with Rebecca being gone. In the film, however, she not only dramatically sets the fire herself, but also dies in the fire, fitting into the common film trope where queer-coded characters must not only be the villains, but also face a very grim end. They must die. But Rebecca, with all of her queer subtext, was lucky to be made into a film at all. There were so many books in this time that were just completely looked over that would have made really good adaptations, but just never got the chance because they were gay. There was The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall that was never adapted at all thanks to its very explicit lesbian content. There's Nightwood by Jejuna Barnes from 1936, again very explicit lesbian themes. Strange Brother by Blair Niles from 1931 is one of the earliest American novels to sympathetically portray gay men set in Harlem's queer scene. Nothing, no adaptation. Spring Fire by Vin Packer was perhaps the first major lesbian pulp fiction novel. We'll talk about pulp fiction novels in a little bit. It was released even before The Price of Salt before Carol, and this book did end in tragedy, as was required of any queer book at this time. Like, you could write a queer book, but it had to end badly. Again, even with the bad ending, it was never adapted into film. So what impact did this have on LGBTQ plus perception and representation? a big one, a big impact. Queer people for many decades were forced to read between the lines for any slither of representation. In this time, there was no positive, explicit representation for LGBTQ plus people in films, TVs, or literature. A queer person was forced to hide in the shadows, to believe that they themselves are wrong and perverted. All of this just reinforced the idea that queer people was unnatural or even dangerous. And the after effects of the Hays Code are something that we're still battling with even to this day. Old habits die hard, or lesbians die hard. Every time, in everything they're ever in. Yes, we're about to talk about Bury Your Gays. That was a really good segue. I was very proud of myself for that one, I'm not gonna lie. One of the most damaging legacies of the Hays Code is this idea that your queer character must always suffer or die. It prohibited happy endings for queer people. So if you're gonna have a queer character in your book or in your movie, they were going to have a pretty tough time of it. Like, they had to. Many films killed off their queer-coded characters in very twisted, very awful ways, and it served as a lesson to the audiences. If you're going to be queer, this is what's going to happen to you. And I say queer-coded characters here because even then, they're killing off these characters for being gay, but they would never explicitly say that they're gay. It was all in the code, all in the subtext, because they could never say the word gay or lesbian in these films, ever. The queer-coded characters were the villains who deserved punishment, or perhaps even worse, they'd be forced to end up in a straight relationship at the end of the film. Everything back to normal, they would pay for their sins, they were now happy, they were straight, they were as they should be. I mean, off the top of my head, I have so many examples of the Bury Your Gays trope. Killing Eve, anyone? Killing Eve. Anyone still so incredibly angry about that one? No. I will never, ever get over Killing Eve. Brokeback Mountain, I suppose, is a good example. The 100, when they killed off Lexa, that actually sparked a huge backlash online. People went mad when they killed off Lexa, and the writers actually came forward and said that they weren't aware of Bury Your Gays being a trope, but now they would be aware of that going forward. Because that's the kind of thing with this, it's very insidious. Like, writers don't go in to the writing room thinking like, okay, we're going to kill off the lesbian because that is what we need to do. That is like what is expected of us. Like, it's not that insidious and obvious anymore. But after decades and decades of this same formula being repeated in movies, it just becomes subconscious. It just becomes this thing in the back of your head. If you have a queer character, they need to die. Luckily though, I do find that the Bury Your Gays trope is not that prevalent in queer literature, which is good. That's a win. However, something that is very prevalent in literature, maybe not so much in queer literature in which they are centering queer characters, but in straight literature, general literature, is the idea of having a token gay character, a token queer character. And let's face it, like, on the face of this isn't the worst trope you can have. A lot of the time, straight authors will include a gay character as a sidekick, as the main character's best friend, and they become reduced to this stereotype of what straight people think queer people are, and that is perhaps a whole other video. I actually do have a video that I'm currently writing about should straight authors be writing queer characters, which is going to be a very, very interesting one. But a lot of the time I do find that straight authors, especially in straight romance, love to include one single gay character, just one, as somewhat of a box-ticking exercise to be like, yes, I did this. Look, I'm such a good ally. I'm featuring a gay character in my very straight book, but I'm giving them no backstory. I'm giving them no character. They are just there and they are gay, and I'm making sure you know they're gay, and that is all I'm doing with that. And that does very much raise a question of, is it better to have no representation than badly thought out representation? I feel like I went on a tangent there, but basically the Hays Code loved to diminish queer characters instead of centering them, and that is something we still see today in literature. We're coming back round onto it. I mean, every few years there is an outrage, an outcry about Disney featuring their first ever gay characters, and now whenever I see that, I see an article entitled like, Disney's first gay character is coming in this film, and I'm like, we have seen this same thing so many times. Off the top of my head, we have LeFou in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, the live action. There was a massive thing about LeFou being Disney's first out gay character. I watched that film. Do I remember anything gay in it? Not at all. Was he just queer-coded a little bit? Yes, that was it. There was no explicit portrayal of gayness in that movie. There's the first lesbian couple in Finding Dory, and that was a massive thing. People were so happy that there was a first ever lesbian couple being represented in Finding Dory. They were on screen for less than 3 seconds. Less than 3 seconds. A massive one for me was Valkyrie in Thor Ragnarok. Like, listen, I love Valkyrie. I love her. I love Tessa Thompson. Mwah. Everything she does, obsessed with her. Favourite Marvel character, incredible. She was not explicitly gay in that film. People love to talk about her like she is, and Tessa Thompson said in an interview that Valkyrie is bisexual. At that point in Thor Ragnarok, it was not explicitly stated that she is gay. Again, it was queer coding. It was saying after the fact that there is a queer character in this film, but not actually showing it on screen. Why are they so scared to actually show it on screen? We'll get to that in a second. I suppose you could say with Valkyrie in Captain Marvel, perhaps there was a little bit more explicit lesbianing, but actually no, I don't even think there was explicit lesbianing. There's a moment of tension between Captain Marvel and Valkyrie. There's a look, the lesbian longing. I see it there. Is it explicitly said? I can't really remember. I don't think it is. There are so many more examples I can make, but you get my point. Disney think they're being progressive by featuring a lesbian couple in their cartoon for less than 3 seconds, and that's meant to be representation. It's not. That's not representation. That is just putting it in so you can satiate queer audiences or liberal audiences who are asking for this kind of stuff without angering the straight conservative audiences. But you're still pandering to them. And this kind of leads into my next point about a fear of explicit queerness. Even today, a lot of media hesitates to show LGBTQ plus couples as openly and as naturally as their straight counterparts. Straight couples are always obvious. Queer couples, a blink and you miss it. I can't tell you the amount of times I've walked out of the cinema with my straight friends and I've been like, did you notice that queer couple? Did you see that queer character? And they're like, no. Because they're not looking for it, they don't see it. That is how quick, and because I'm queer, because I'm looking out for that representation, I see that, and I'm happy with those scraps. But for straight people, it goes over their heads. And that is very much by design, don't get me wrong. You also have the no-label characters that avoid clear identification in order to appeal to conservative audiences, but are insanely queer-coded enough to appeal to a queer audience. Let me tell you, there is nothing more feral than a queer teenage girl who sniffs a millimetre of gay in her favourite character. Nothing more feral. How do I know that? I was that teenage girl. I still am that teenage girl at 30 years old. Pitch Perfect with Becca and Chloe is a prime example of this. They queer-coded those characters so much. They gave them so many near misses, near kisses, so many gay, lesbian yearning moments. And did they ever do anything with it? No, of course they didn't, because they're not going to alienate the conservative audiences like that. But they're going to hint at it constantly in every single movie. They're going to drive people mad, so all the lesbians online are talking about it and making other lesbians watch it. But they're not actually going to do it. Another example is probably Regina and Emma in Once Upon a Time. I feel like at the beginning of the series, they didn't realise that people would really feel the chemistry between those two characters as much as they did. In the later seasons, they ramped it up. They knew what they were doing. And it all comes back round to the Hays Code. Filmmakers have to imply queerness through subtext rather than making it explicit. It's still expected that TV and film do this. And whereas a lot of TV and film still has its storytelling patterns shaped by the Hays Code, literature, especially queer literature, is able to avoid this a lot of the time. And why is that? And I'm literally going to read this directly from my notes because I feel like I wrote this so well that if I don't read it out verbatim, I'm going to be so mad at myself. So here's what I wrote. I think it comes down to who holds the power here. The TV and film industries are still largely controlled by executives and producers who prioritise mainstream, which is largely heteronormative, audiences. Even when queer creators are involved, they can often face pushback from studios that fear alienating broader audiences. At the end of the day, the straight, white, middle-class person is going to be the one with the money to spend in the cinema. Minorities and marginalised communities are often downtrodden. They're less likely to have that money to spare. Global and mass audiences, including the conservative market, which is sadly massive, demand queer tragedies or erasure. I mean, we've all seen the conservatives crying on social media because their favourite TV show now has one queer character, that's it. But that is enough for us to be rubbing it in their faces. For those conservative people and for the TV creators, the producers, directors, tropes like bury your gays are safe and familiar because they know they can include this queer character, and if it goes down badly, It's fine. They can kill them and everyone is happy. The conservative person sees the gay person getting what they deem to be punishment for their sins. And there's also just the fact that TV and film executives are often older, they're very out of touch with fandom discourse, with what young people want to see on screen. Queer characters are treated as expendable side characters, never important or interesting enough to have their own stories. And Hollywood undeniably equates serious storytelling with tragedy. So when there is a queer person, there's going to be tragedy around them. But why is literature so different? Why does literature not fall victim to a lot of these traps? Because undeniably there is no shortage of queer literature, like it is what my entire channel is based on. All of these books, like I said, they're gay. The publishing world, especially indie and smaller presses, allow for more direct control by queer authors, and even in mainstream publishing, there is a bigger push for diverse voices. LGBTQ+ authors are the ones crafting their own narratives. It's much easier to sit at home and write your own book through your own life experiences than try and reach the point in the TV and film industry where you're going to be able to make any changes on a fundamental level. It's a lot easier to sit at home and write a book and send it out to publishers and get it published. I say easier. I know that's not easy, but you get what I'm trying to say. Literature is more personal and appeals to niche audiences who are actively seeking out their own representation, meaning it's more likely to break out of these harmful tropes. I mean, obviously queer books are full of their own tropes, don't get me wrong, like I'd say solid 30% of these books are full of the fake dating trope, but that's not harmful. Tropes are normal. Harmful tropes are what we should be focusing on. Queer literature fought to move past this sort of like trauma-centric storytelling and now focuses on queer joy, on queer survival. Basically, I wrote here, I love this sentence, queer literature thrives because it's often written by queer people for queer people and is controlled by queer people. TV and film operate under corporate structures that prioritise marketability over authentic representation. One of the very first examples of a queer book subverting all of the expectations of the Hays Code is The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. You might also know it as Carol. This book was published in 1952. And it was revolutionary. It changed the game. It was just radical. It defied all of the usual expectations of a queer book having to have a tragic ending. It featured lesbian romance where neither woman was corrupt or predatory. It ended on a hopeful note where Carol and Therese could be together. It didn't end with them together, but it was open-ended enough. Like, it wasn't an unhappy, tragic ending, like they could have been together. And it critiqued societal pressures of this time. It depicts Carol's custody battle as she's trying to get custody of her daughter, who's been taken away from her because she's been accused of being gay. And this storyline wasn't included as a punishment for Carol to be like, this is what's going to happen when you're gay. This was just included because this was a real life consequence of being gay in this time. You would lose your children. It wasn't because Carol was a villain, it was a criticism of what was going on at this time. And through having these storylines, the book directly violated the Hays Code. Like I said, it was radical. And this meant that Hollywood couldn't adapt it into a film. I mean, good, because at this time they probably would have reframed the entire relationship as just really good friends or a passing phase that ruined their lives. The custody battle would have been reframed as a punishment and the ending would have been tragic. They probably both would have ended up in straight relationships and or dead. The Price of Salt was fundamentally about love, not suffering, and that made it impossible to adapt into a movie at this time. But it was eventually made into a movie in 2015 featuring Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara. And this movie was revolutionary even in 2015. I'm not saying by any means that it was the first queer lesbian movie to be released. We know full well that's not true. But it was kind of one of the first mainstream lesbian films to be released. It was the first one that was in cinemas that people were really, really talking about. I might be wrong there. I didn't do any research into that specific statement I just made, but in my mind that was like the first big one. I remember seeing that in 2015 when I was 21 years old and very much in the closet and just being blown away by seeing that kind of lesbian representation on screen and being surrounded by people in the cinema, straight couples in the cinema, watching it and enjoying it. In its time, Carol, The Price of Salt was considered to be a pulp fiction book, and you probably heard me say pulp fiction throughout a lot of this video. But what exactly was it? What counted as pulp fiction versus regular fiction. Pulp fiction novels were these cheap, mass-produced paperbacks. They were sensationalized with these very lurid, risque covers, and they were widely distributed and accessible in drugstores. They covered taboo subjects of all kinds, like crime, sex, violence, all of which was banned under the Hays Code, and, of course, queer relationships. Whilst mainstream publishing would avoid the queer themes, the pulp fiction boom of the 1940s to 1960s provided a much needed outlet for storytelling. It still had its limitations, of course, but it was better than nothing. Many pulp fiction novels did feature lesbian protagonists disguised as scandalous heterosexual stories in order to avoid censorship. Whilst most queer books would never be allowed to be published, pulp fiction books were, because they were cheaper, they were mass produced, they were just shoved on drugstore shelves and nobody really read them, apart from all the people that did. However, they were still written in the time of the Hays Code, so every queer story would still have to end in tragedy. And I remember once watching an interview with an older lesbian. I've tried to find it to include it in this video. I can't find it. Maybe I made it up. I don't know. But I remember watching an interview with an older lesbian woman who said she always stopped reading her pulp fiction novels 2 chapters towards the end so she wouldn't have to see the lesbian protagonist die. Pulp fiction novels were pretty much the only representation that queer people had in this time. It was a way that queer people could recognise their identity in a world that criminalised them, and also was a small act of resistance against the censorship that they came up against. Most authors would ignore queer people entirely in their writings, but pulp fiction novels, they didn't shy away from queerness. Sure, the queer person would have to die or end up in a straight relationship, but again, it brings us round to the question of, is bad representation better than no representation at all? And a lot of queer people in this time said that they lived for their pulp fiction books. It wasn't the best representation, they knew it was always going to end in tragedy, but it was there, it existed. Pulp fiction is a vital part of LGBTQ plus literature history, and I actually do really want to film a video for this channel where I read some pulp fiction books from the 1950s. I'm really excited for that. I'm going to do it. I just need to figure out which ones I'm going to read because that will be so interesting, I'm sure. By the late 1960s, the popularity of pulp fiction did begin to decline in line with the Hays Code also falling, but also because the Stonewall riots happened in 1969 and queer activism started to move out more into the mainstream. There wasn't as much of a need anymore for these hidden away pulp fiction books. Queer representation was happening out in everyday life. For 3 whole decades, from 1934 to 1968, the Hays Code dictated what could and couldn't appear on our screens, but of course, that wasn't going to last forever. Its downfall came as part of a very slow but probably inevitable cultural revolution that started to happen from the 1960s onwards, and filmmakers just refused to be censored anymore. They wanted to tell the stories that they wanted to tell. I mean, in this time, European films obviously ignored all American censorship rules because it wasn't relevant. European filmmakers could do whatever the hell they wanted, and European films started to get more popular in the USA as lines of communication, as technology started to improve. So people were just watching European films instead of American films. And independent directors, 3 of the studios, also started to just kind of say fuck it and started to make whatever it is they wanted to make because they didn't have a studio telling them what to do. In 1952 as well, the Miracle decision was ruled, that is Joseph Burstyn Inc. versus Wilson, ruling that films were protected under the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech, which basically meant the movies were seen as art, not as just entertainment, and therefore they were allowed to have freedom. That was 1952, still took another 16 years, but that was a big moment. And slowly, filmmakers just started to make whatever the hell they wanted. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, which included violence and a very queer-coded main character, Norman Bates. It was scandalous. It was 1960, 8 years before the official fall of the Hays Code. But people just kind of stopped caring. People wanted to see what they wanted to see. There was also the rise of counterculture in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, second wave feminism, all challenging these traditional moral values that had ruled for so many years. Audiences, especially younger audiences, wanted realism and grit in their films, not these sanitized, boring love stories that didn't have anything to do with their lives. The Hays Code simply just lost control. People stopped caring and it didn't have any power anymore, and that was it. In 1966, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was released without box office approval and became a massive hit. books. In 1967, Bonnie and Clyde broke all of the rules on violence and sexuality and became critically acclaimed. And then in 1968, Hollywood replaced the Hays Code entirely with the MPAA rating system, which basically rates things on age appropriateness rather than just outright censoring them. And that's still what they have today: PG, PG-13, etc. But as we've covered in depth in this episode, in this video, the lingering effects of the Hays Code are very much still seen in TV, in film, but queer literature, luckily, seems to be escaping. At least in queer books written by queer authors. I think a lot of straight authors trying to include queer representation in their books still very much fall victim to some of the standard tropes, the token character especially. But queer literature, that's thriving. In the years after the Hays Code, classics like Ruby Fruit Jungle, The Colour Purple, Zami, Tales of the City, Dancer from the Dance, Loving Her, sorry I'm just reading from my list now, were written and released, all celebrating queer culture, queer lives. And that was unimaginable during the 1930s. It just wouldn't have happened. And that's something that improves year on year on year. I mean, I remember being a teenager only 15 years ago and being in my school library looking for any queer representation whatsoever. I didn't know what my sexuality was then, but I just knew that I wanted to see these stories written on the page. I wanted to read about them. I wanted to learn. And I just remember not being able to find anything. I couldn't find myself represented in any books. And I remember when I found my first queer book, I read it like 4 or 5 times in a row because I was just so desperate for that kind of representation. That was 15 years ago, and I was searching high and low. And now I've got bookcases full. I shed a tear earlier this year when I was admittedly very PMSy looking for all the queer book releases that are coming up in 2025, and the list I found online just went on and on and on. There are so many books being released every single month featuring queer stories, queer joy, queer resistance, queer love, and it's incredible. Anyway, I know this video is a little bit different for this channel. I haven't really done like a video essay, deep dive kind of thing like this before, but if you like it, let me know and maybe I can do more. I can definitely do more. I have a list as long as my arm. But yeah, if you like what I'm doing here, make sure you subscribe to this channel. That'd be great. If you stuck around to the end, then you should probably be subscribed. Leave a comment down below and tell me something. Tell me anything. Comments tell YouTube that you like what I'm doing and you are engaging with this content, and that's only a good thing. Yeah, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.